Okay. There's nothing worse than seeing somebody who supposedly is an expert in informatics have difficulty with a computer during a presentation, so I apologize for that. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about contracts for laboratory information systems. This may seem like a really dry topic, and for some, I guess it is, but there's a lot of reasons to understand something about contracts if you are ever going to be dealing with the purchase of a new system for any reason. And really, if you get nothing else out of this 25-minute talk, because I do know I'm standing in between you and your break, actually a little bit later, we have until 2:50, it's that what's included in that contract is just as important as what isn't included in that contract, and you really have to look for the stuff that's been left out of a contract in order to make sure that you don't get burned. I don't have any financial disclosures to report. I do have a few disclaimers, though, one of which is that I am not an attorney, nor do I play one on TV. The talk that I'm giving you today is really based on my experience of reviewing quite a few contracts since I joined Emory as the Director of Pathology Informatics. The checklist that I have in the back of the room really is to be used as a convenience to you to kind of understand what's typical to be included in contracts and why it might be important to have it in there if your contract that you're looking at doesn't have it. This really does not represent legal advice, and if you need legal advice about a contract, I mean, the first thing I would tell you is that anytime you're looking at a contract, you should always have an attorney that you have hired or that your institution has hired to review that contract. The second thing is that if you have any questions about a contract, obviously you should be directing that to your attorney as they can help you out with that. So the checklist is intended, it's a checklist that I actually use myself when I'm kind of looking at contracts to make sure that I haven't forgotten something. Because when you're looking at a 75-page contract for the third time or for the first time, you know, it can be easy to get bogged down in the details and to kind of forget that there are pieces that you need to make sure are in there. And so I have 60 copies in the back of the room, so just make sure you get one. And if you don't have one, that's my email address right there, so just email me and I'll send you a PDF copy. Okay, so a couple of terms used. These are not typical terms, but for the purpose of this talk, rather than saying system under negotiation 1,000 times, we're just going to call that the sun. No reference to it being, you know, the sun or anything. And the company basically is the company selling the system to you. So there are phases of contract review. You're going to, you know, as Mark Tuthill was talking about earlier, you're going to have a process by which you're going to select a system. And generally speaking, you will have already selected a system by the time you get to the point of having a contract in your hands for review. So you're going to select a system first. I'm not going to go over that piece here. Mark did a beautiful job of that. You're going to do some homework on what you're going to need as part of this system. Hopefully you've done that during the system selection process, but if you haven't, we're going to talk about some of the things that you need to look at prior to getting the contract in your hands. These are things that you need to communicate to the vendor to make sure that they're starting out with a fair baseline. Other things is that when you get the contract, you need to check the items you've received for review. You need to review the contract, and then you need to provide your feedback to your attorney, not to the company's attorneys, not to anybody else's attorneys, not to the company, to your attorney. And then you let your attorney handle the negotiations. So homework. So there's a long list of laundry items that you need to think of when you're looking at contracts. The first is user licenses. You may have already had some conversations with the vendor about how they price your licensing. That can be done one of two ways in my experience, either by the total number of users in the system or by the number of concurrent licenses that they have. Concurrent licenses, I usually use a ballpark estimate of take everybody who's going to need to have access to the system and divide it by 3. And that's going to be your estimated number of concurrent users for the system. You need to figure out how you're going to host the hardware for your system. Is it going to be hosted locally with local IT support? Are you going to host it locally with remote IT support? Are you going to host it remotely with remote IT support? Those all play a big impact as to what needs to be included in your contract. And then there's interfaces. This is the one where I really have to sit down and think about all the interfaces that we need and make sure that they're all built into the contract. So you kind of have to do an inventory of your laboratory system and what this system needs to be able to do. What other systems does it need to be able to communicate with? Do you have an internal EMR, an external set of EMRs, and this would include outside hospitals, web portals, patient portals, if legal, because in some states those aren't exactly legal. Internal laboratory information systems, external ones, instruments, and middleware. You also need to think about whether or not your institution has got a backup management plan. Some institutions actually have a defined way by which all data on all systems in their institution is backed up and managed, because it makes it easier for their own internal IT staff to support and recover that data should you go into a downtime. And, you know, how are the files sent and retrieved from it? You know, if you're going to be using images, do you need to have images? You know, how will the images be acquired? Do you need to use gross photos versus micrographs versus electropherograms, which are imported from an instrument? And how are those images going to be used? Do you need data migration? So I do need to add some stuff. Typically, in addition to anatomic pathology, you're going to want to migrate your data for a couple of other systems, blood bank being one of them, because having that antibody history on hand for patients is critically important to the blood banker's ability to be able to take care of them, but also HLA and compatibility testing, because prior donor-specific antibodies are very important for these patients, and so those are other systems that you're going to need to include for data migration. And then the other reminder that I would give you is, if you're not going to migrate your data, you still have to be able to have access to it. So if sometimes in contracts you're going to have to include whether or not you are going to get access to the old data. Sorry, not whether you get access, but how you're going to get access. Sometimes that means you have to have a separate contract with the other information system that you're migrating from. Other times, if it happens to be the same company that's housing your old system as well as your new system, it's going to be included in that migration, that implementation contract that you're going to be looking at. Before you get the contract, it is important to discuss among your staff, if you don't already have a mechanism by which this happens, as to who is actually going to be reviewing the contract. Again, this is a situation where if you have too many people looking at it, some of the feedback may not be congruous with what the institution normally does in certain situations. So are you going to review the contract? Is your LIS team going to review it? Subject matter experts, the laboratory medical director, who's going to review this contract? Because you have to make sure that they get copies of it for review prior to it being signed. And again, your attorney really should always be reviewing these. But attorneys don't understand laboratory workflow, and they're not going to understand that there are pieces of contracts which may just not work in your lab. And so your job really is to serve as a subject matter expert to ensure that the contract is going to be compatible with what you're doing. So once you've received the contract, most contracts, at least the ones I've seen, have a table of contents in them. You need to check the table of contents, and then you need to go through your contract, which sometimes can be 75 to 100 pages long, and make sure that you have all the pieces. I have yet to get a single contract where all the pieces were included. It's pretty typical for some of them to be omitted, and really the missing parts can be the pieces that will be your biggest headache later on, so make sure that you get all of the pieces of the contract to review. You need to look at the contract and see, so when you're reviewing the contract itself, you need to look at the contract and see if they make any stipulations about the software being compliant with certain regulations or also being compliant with certain standards. Now, regulations and standards are different. Regulations mean that by law you are required to do a certain thing. Standards are, it would be nice to adhere to these if we could. It will promote interoperability. It will promote other things that we are able to do more easily in the laboratory, but they're not required by law, and so you may find that different systems don't adhere to those. It is important to think about having those included in your contract. I have run into software vendors who were not compliant with federal law by the way that they were managing their data, and you find that out pretty quickly when you ask them to put it in writing and they refuse. Scope of work. So this is really the reality check piece, and this is one of the things that you have to have conversations with your LIS manager and the staff. And you have to define who is responsible for what. Are all of your sites included? What is the company supposed to do? What are their employees responsible for? What are you supposed to do during the implementation? I've read contracts where this was not clearly defined, and that can come to a problem later on when there's a he said, she said about who's actually responsible for having done the work. I've run into other contracts where it was specified down to the last detail as to who was going to be responsible for what. And even though those are a pain to read through and to try to make sure that everything sounds okay, on the flip side, there's complete clarity once the contract is signed and you don't have issues with that later. Some contracts, good contracts, just as Dr. Tuthill was saying earlier, your project needs to have deadlines. And the same thing is true of contracts. Most contracts will have some sort of deadline attached to them. The deadline could be relative or it could be absolute. The larger and more complex the project is, having absolute deadlines can be difficult to adhere to. So it may be that you have relative deadlines. What I've seen in some contracts is that if there's no activity on the part of the, us, the laboratory, for 90 days, the vendor or the company has the right to cancel the project, and you'll be due this much money and all of that. So I have seen it done that way. I've also seen it done the other way where there were absolute deadlines. Absolute deadlines, though, can get you into trouble. You really need to look at the penalties for not meeting those deadlines at certain places. You may owe them money. You may not be able to carry forward with the project. Your resources from the company could be diverted elsewhere under the contract, and you won't be able to say anything about it, and who knows when you're going to get it back on their list of projects. Term and termination. So this is frequently used in contracts. The term is the term that the contract is valid for. Most of the contracts that I have seen have an auto renewal piece to the term. However, there are some contracts, particularly if it's for a piece of software that you're only planning to use on a temporary basis, that you may want to put in a specific expiration date into that contract. But you do need to be careful about reading these, because sometimes they'll try, sometimes people will try to sneak in there that if you don't do a certain thing on an annual basis, that your contract will expire. So you have to look for those, and that's where having your attorney review the contract can be important, because they pick out those things and make sure that you're aware of them. Termination is very important. There's a couple of different methods by which your contract can be terminated. There's obviously, the company could terminate it, you could terminate it, and you really need to understand the parameters under which that works so that you don't do anything that could get you into a lot of trouble and make you pay a lot of money. There's termination for cause, meaning one of the parties in the contract breached the contract, and then the other party a lot of times has the right to then cancel the contract with penalties associated to the offending party. And then there can also be termination for without cause, and the prime example of that is I want to convert to a completely new laboratory information system or a new piece of software that does this particular function. So what do I have to do in order to be able to release myself from this previous contract? And these are very important, especially if your contract is auto-renewing, because it will require additional action. Usually you'll have to give the company a certain amount of notice, and that can vary. Is that amount of notice reasonable? You'll have to look at all of those things. The other thing that many people forget in a contract is what happens if the company goes out of business. Needless to say, if the company goes out of business, the company's support for your software is gone. So now what do you do? And that could happen with very little notice. So what I've seen in some cases is they have written into the contract that the source code for the application will be released to you and your institution in the event that happens. This is not an ideal situation by a long shot, but at least if you have programmers on staff, they might be able to get in and fix problems if you have them, should that happen. That's a very temporizing measure, though. Generally speaking, when the vendor of a company goes out of business, you need to be seeking another piece of software that's going to be able to do what you need it to do. And having your own IT people supporting it is really a temporizing measure. So uptime. It's very important to have in your contract % uptime built into that, because otherwise you really could spend more of your time in your laboratory information system being down and not being able to use it with no contractual stipulation to make the vendor keep the system up and running for you on a regular basis. Most contracts that I've seen actually require 99% uptime per month, but they will have certain exclusions and caveats to that. They'll say, if the end users, us, the laboratory, require a downtime for maintenance, that doesn't count against the overall % uptime. So you really need to look at the details of all of that in your contract to understand exactly what that is. Your purpose in reading that piece of the contract as somebody who works in a laboratory is to ensure that you're not going to be in a situation where you can't use your system because it keeps going down and have no recourse against the company for landing you in a situation where you've got a system that keeps going down and crashing. Other exceptions that I think can be given for system uptime is that if the company determines that the reason for the downtime is due to end-user tampering or purposefully crashing the system, needless to say, the company has to protect themselves, and so they're not going to want to have that counted against their percent uptime. So support and maintenance is also a very important piece of the contract to look at. When is the support and maintenance available? Is it 24/7, 365 days a year, or is it only available from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., Monday through Friday, and no holidays? For some systems that you bring in, that lower level of support may be okay. If it's not a patient care critical system, if it's something that if it goes down overnight and doesn't get fixed until the next day, that nobody's really going to suffer, then, that may be okay. Generally speaking, in healthcare, though, we all like to have 24/7, 365 as our support. So the other thing you need to look at is their guarantees on turnaround time for support. If you have a critical laboratory information system downtime, you want people to respond to that right away. But if in your contract it says they have up to 4 hours to call you back, that may not be acceptable for you. So it's very important to make sure that you understand the terms of the contract and negotiate for different terms to the contract for that. And then the other thing is, what exactly is supported? Do they support the software? Do they support the hardware? Are they just going to hold your hand through the whole process while you cry? I mean, it's, you really have to make sure that you understand those pieces. And the other thing is what type of support. As you've probably seen from other pieces of software or from web portals that you've used, some will come with email support, some will come with phone calls, other things will come with on-site visits. IT contracts are really no different from that, and you have to make sure that you've got the appropriate level of support for what you need. Some contracts I've seen actually do charge you if you go above a certain number of hours of support per year. They'll actually tack on a price per hour if you go beyond what they consider to be the average of an institution your size. Make sure that you look at that and you determine that that's acceptable. Updates. So updates are pretty interesting because everybody needs to keep their system relatively updated. But I ran into a contract just recently that really wanted us to update, and this was, wanted us to update a critical functioning piece of our information system infrastructure every 90 days. And this particular update would have required each time Liz's group dropping everything and testing all of these functions all over the place. Needless to say, this is an update schedule that is absolutely unrealistic in a functioning laboratory. So you do have to look at those things. We generally at our institution go with, we're going to take an update once a year, whatever that update happens to be. If they require you to go more frequently than that, then I think personally from my perspective it just doesn't seem to be workable. So data migration, again, you need to figure out if data migration is included, if it needs to be included. You need to determine what they're saying about when it's going to be migrated. Sometimes it may be okay for that data to be migrated after go live, and as long as you have access to the data in the interim. Other times you may want to have the data migrated by the day of go live. If it's not going to be migrated by the day of go live, you have to figure out how people are going to get access to the old data. And that really can be important because, in anatomic pathology, they need access to this historical data at frozen section. They don't have time to be dinking around and finding data in some other system. For blood bank, again, this could be a stat cross match that they're having to do on a patient. Having that historical data on blood bank antibodies that this patient has is very important for patient care. So images, where I have been burned on images is when the contract actually starts requiring that you use very specific hardware to acquire those images. So for example, it's not okay just to use any camera that can take a JPEG photo. They actually want you to take a certain camera and use that for your JPEG photos because they've built a special driver that goes only to those devices. And so then you have to sort of figure out, do I want to spend all the money purchasing new cameras, or do we think we can limp it along without doing that? So those are things that you have have to look at. You may be okay with buying completely new cameras. And then backups. Are the backups included? If they're not, if you're doing this for patient data, they should be. I mean, that's my opinion. Is the mechanism by which the backups are going to happen compatible with your institution's requirements? So that's part of the homework, is that you have to figure out what your institution's requirements are and make sure that that's okay. Where are the backup files going to be stored? Are they secure? Emory was on the national news recently, I have to say, because there was an information system migration that took place, and they took the old data from the old system, put it onto DVDs in some very nice binders in someone's office in the surgical suite. And the surgical offices, those DVDs went missing. And under high-tech, because there's a security breach notification rule that we're now required to put out, we actually had to report publicly on the news that we had lost 315,000 patients worth of data, 285,000 patients of which included names, dates of birth, and social security numbers. So knowing where your backup files are being stored and whether they are secure or not is very important, because I can tell you that one mistake, that one tiny mistake that I am quite sure, if you tell me that you don't have any of these issues at your institution, I would probably say that we need to have a discussion about some vacation property in Florida near swampland. But the deal is that, you need to make sure that you know where the data is and that it's secure. This one incident cost Emory well over $2 million. Not just from reporting it out to the public, but offering credit monitoring for all of those patients who had been affected, trying to find all of those patients who may have been affected, because this included a 17-year history of patients. Security of patient data is really very important, and I wouldn't take it lightly. Non-disclosure clauses. This has been the subject of a heated debate on another listserv that I sit on for the American Medical Informatics Association. When I buy a house, I can get a home inspector to come in and inspect the house. When I buy a car, I can go on to Carfax.com and look up that car's history if it's a used car, or I can look up on ConsumerReports.com and get safety ratings that this car has received. How many of you, outside of potentially class, are able to do that with a laboratory information system or with software? Well, one of the primary reasons, since nobody's raising their hand, is because there are non-disclosure clauses in most IT contracts that you sign with a vendor company. Now, I don't want to, the vendor companies have a vested interest in maintaining their proprietary software, and I definitely understand that. Ideas get stolen all the time, and it's never good for the company who came up with it originally. But on the flip side, it also prevents those of us from sort of comparing and contrasting and do what we do in the United States for that type of activity. So you need to look at the contract. You need to be aware that there are certain things that you can't tell people outside of your institution about your information system, or the company could come after you. But the same thing, by the same token, you also need to make sure that in that contract there's included non-disclosure agreements for the company to not disclose information about your institution to their other clients, or about your patients, because they will have access to patient data as part of this implementation, and you need to make sure that they keep it secure. This is often covered by a business associate agreement. This is how we do it at Emory. There's a standard business associate agreement that we make all of our vendor companies sign. So payment. This is also important. You need to know how and when you're going to pay them for this implementation. Most places, contracts that I have seen actually have a 40% down, and then there's 30% at the time of go live, and then the last 30% is at acceptance. And acceptance is usually where you're like, the go live went fine, system's functioning, we're not going to pull it back out. So it can happen relatively quickly after the go live has taken place. I have seen some contracts come across my desk where they wanted us to pay 100% up front at the time we signed the contract. I think that this is a notoriously bad idea, because then they have your money, and trying to get work out of them sometimes can be difficult at that point. The other thing you need to look at in contracts is price increases. These are often written into the contracts, and they will typically say things like they can raise your price with 90 days notice, 3 to 5% per year. So when you're doing your calculations for the 5-year cost of the system, you need to build that in to what you think it's going to be at the end of the day, assuming that they do the maximum increase. If they don't have a cap on the increase, then you should beware. Comparing systems is not typical at this stage of the game. Usually you've already selected your system at this point, but you should always compare 5-year costs when you're doing a request for proposal, for example. Generally speaking, those costs will be included in a request for proposal. And so I have a worksheet, as I stated, that has kind of some charts for ways to help you calculate those 5-year costs. What's interesting, the 5-year cost is important because you can have two companies who sell an equivalent system, one of whom has an implementation cost of $100,000. The other company has an implementation cost of $150,000. And for someone who's not familiar with running, looking at contracts, they may definitely say, well, we're just going to go with System A because it's $100,000. But what they're not looking at is the fact that System A's support and maintenance agreement actually has $100,000 per year in support and maintenance. So if you calculate that over 5 years, you've got the implementation cost of $100 the first year, plus the support and maintenance of $100 for the first year, so it's $200 for the first year alone, plus another $400 for years 2, 3, 4, and 5, so that's a total of $600,000. For Company B, whose implementation cost was higher, $150,000, their support and maintenance agreement is $50,000 per year. So year one is still $200,000, but over the next 4 years, you're only paying another $200,000. Over the span of 5 years, you're actually $200,000 better off with Company B. So it's very important that you look at those 5-year costs, because you may realize down the road that it's going to be cheaper for the institution to go with the one that's going to be pricier at the outset. So in conclusion, I do want to tell you, contract review is tedious. When you get a 75-page contract, it doesn't exactly happen one time. You're going to be looking at that same contract probably 3 or 4 times as it goes through its multiple iterations. It is painful, but it is definitely worth it at the end, and it can save you a lot of headache. I can't even tell you, I'm sure Liz can't even tell you, the number of times I've gone into a meeting is like, well, that's interesting that you want to do it that way because the contract says this. And that's a very powerful tool to have at your fingertips when things are not going how you had expected that they would. You do definitely need to watch out for changes on multiple iterations. I can't tell you the number of times also that I have had attorneys from the company pull sections out that we had asked to put in 2 iterations later because they thought we had forgotten about it. And this is where doing your compare documents function in your Word editor or any other thing that you have can be really important. So we can do some questions, but I'm going to do some polling because this was my idea. I hope you like it. We'll put it on the feedback. Okay, so true or false, contracts can only be read and understood by experienced contract attorneys. I know I'm standing in between people in their break. We still have 10 minutes. One person. Okay, 5 people. It's just a bit of a delay. So that's absolutely correct. I mean, anybody can really read and understand a contract, but again, the contract also needs to be read by the attorney, okay? Next poll. True or false? Experienced contract attorneys are experts in laboratory information systems. Okay, someone has a very optimistic view of experienced contract attorneys. And I mean, you can actually find experienced contract attorneys who do this all the time, and so they do have expertise in this area. But generally speaking, that's why it's important for you as a pathologist, as somebody who works in a laboratory, to read and understand what's in your contract and to understand where that may or may not fit in with your laboratory workflow. Who answered that right away? You people know me so well. So, as it turns out, my dad actually is an attorney, although he's not a contract attorney. But being an attorney certainly does not pass its way down biologically. Although, when you get into an argument with an attorney on a regular basis, then you kind of learn how they think. But yes, I do not like getting burned. And finding out that you have signed a contract that is going to pinion you in to a certain situation is never a good feeling. I definitely recommend to everybody reading their contracts and understanding them, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Okay, clearly you guys are focused on break. So go have your break, and we are going to start back at 3:10. So we're going to start back at 3:10 with our next speaker. Thanks.